Hello and welcome to AWANI Global. I'm your host, Fana Sheh. Now we are at the sideline of the 38 Asia Pacific Roundtable here at Hilton, Kuala Lumpur. Now, in recent years, we've seen a growing shift as governments and companies rethink their dependence on China for manufacturing and critical components. But is this shift purely about the US-China rivalry, or is it something deeper that is happening? How are these trends playing out in Southeast Asia, and what does it all mean for the future of globalization? Right, joining us are two esteemed guests who were in the panel on China Plus One strategy. Professor Volker Perthes, Senior Distinguished Fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, as well as Associate Professor Simon Tay, Chairman of the Singapore Institute of International Affairs. Thank you so much for joining me, gentlemen. Right, let's set the scene first to get the audience rolling on this topic. When we talk about China Plus One, what does this shift tell us about the state of the global supply chains today, especially with what is happening right now with increased trade tensions, geopolitical shifts? Anyone can take this first.
Sure.
All right, okay, sure.
I think we're not speaking so much about China Plus One right now. It's a concept from the early 2000s, which was initially a business strategy, rising labor costs in China at that point. So companies did get some of their business out into lower paying countries, with the consent of the Chinese, of the US, of everybody else, and of course countries like Vietnam, like Malaysia were benefiting from it. And then it was geopoliticized from like 2017 onwards, the first Trump administration, and the US went for or indicated it would go for decoupling from China. So there was an additional reason for US companies, for example, to move out of China, or at least move out part of the business of China and set up shop mainly in ASEAN countries, but also in Mexico, for example, right? And so there was a geopolitical move on the part of the US administration. For the Europeans, it was a bit different. Most of our production in China is for the Chinese market, actually. And only sort of from, well, let's say 2020, when we felt that Chinese policies become more unfriendly, wolf diplomacy and withholding rare earth from some customers, plus a pandemic with international tensions. Then the Europeans became concerned about supply chains, and they wanted a diversification of supply chains in order to have resilient supply chains. So we have a geopolitical reasoning on the US part, a diversification reasoning on the European part. And now I think we are in the most recent or last phase where we have the Trump tariff offensive, or whatever we call it, which is not about China Plus One. It is about curbing trade with China, or between China and ASEAN countries. So it is rather Asia minus China, which the Trump administration wants to.
If I could jump in there,
Yeah,
I think
sure.
that really, I think Volker is right. There is a longer story, but the key punctuation point, the headlines today, is those Liberation Day tariffs and the subsequent back and forth and negotiations in Geneva and then London. So I think that we are not really at the end of the story, because there are many factors that are working at play. One is the Sino-American rivalry, not just in tariffs and trade generally, but specific technologies, strategic composition. And then there's the domestic issue of what is Mr. Trump trying to do with America? Does he really believe America, with a large, high fence with the whole world, will be better off? And I think that then we have to flip it around and see what it looks like from China's angle. China, I talked about dual circulation. It's gone out into the world with the BRI. If you look at trade numbers between China and Latin America, with Europe, with Africa, they're pretty big everywhere. So China is kind of worried not only about America, being exclusive from the American market, but what does it mean for everybody else and China? And of course, we are in ASEAN. We are Malaysia. We have to really think through the now of trade and supply chains and economic engagement we have with America on one side, with China side, but more than that, globally. I mean, Malaysia is actually a very open economy. My country, Singapore, even more so. We are small, trading countries. And if the world system starts to shake because of all these longer term and Trump-linked initiatives, we are going to face a lot of challenges.
I mean, definitely with the Trump second administration, with increased trade tensions, a lot of smaller economies, I feel, have to take a step back and really reassess what they're doing with their trade relations, what they're doing on the economic side with foreign trade. So I completely agree with you. Right, so talking about the sort of resurgence or revisiting of this China plus one strategy, right? Do you think now, with current tensions right now, intensifying US-China rivalry, are there any other deeper structural factors, you know, economic, political, or even technological, that driving the push to diversify away from China?
Look, I think it is for the countries of this region, for ASEAN, it is about finding a market which is more resilient against shocks like the Liberation Day shock, right, and others. For us in Europe, on the consumer side, is about resilient supply chains which cannot be dependent on just one big country, right? So I think we have a common interest in having more diversified supply chains. I think for the ASEAN countries, the challenge which we see with the tariffs, and which are really hurting some countries bad if they are not negotiated away, Vietnam, Malaysia, others, there is a hard challenge because they have been such a genuine part of this supply chain between China themselves and then Europe and the US. So they will have to use it as an opportunity to integrate more deeply inside ASEAN in order to find a market here, to move up the value chain, which will make it easier to deal with Europe, for example, or with the Gulf countries, or with Latin America, or with Africa, or with others. And then the US will still be there as a market, but ASEAN countries wouldn't be solely dependent on one market. What we heard this morning from the Prime Minister of Malaysia, that, for example, semiconductor production here in Malaysia, more than 60% of the product goes to the US. And of course, that creates a dependence which makes Malaysia vulnerable. So if you diversify the markets by moving up the value chain, I think you can use it as an opportunity.
And this is where I think the three critical words are diversification. Of course, it brings resilience. The second word is rules. And the third, I think, for ASEAN particularly, is unity. Diversification. People are always talking about diversifying the source. So people talk about China plus one as don't get so many materials from China. But I think what Volker has said, and I agree, diversification also of your markets. Right. I mean, the American market and the Chinese production base, they've been the easy ones, right? Everything China makes is good and cheap, or sometimes not so good, but still cheap. And then market, America buys, and buys. Nobody has an appetite for goods like Americans. But I think this is where we got lazy. The economies of scale of production and market made it hard for us to say, how about Africa? How about Middle East, which you just mentioned? Right. How about our own region? How do we grow the market here? How do we go to production base here, originating the value chain? And that's where the second part comes in, rules. Because if you start exploring new markets, and maybe also they look at Trump and they say, I want to be mini Trump. You know, if I'm a big country, India, Indonesia, Brazil, I also close my market. And this is where we have to look for partners, big or small, that will follow what we think are the established rules of trade. EU, therefore, they don't consume as much. Europeans somehow, maybe they're quite satisfied. They don't have the appetite of Americans. Maybe they don't have the big garages, but they don't buy as much. But there are rules-based, and this is something very useful. Of course, they're making new rules of environment, labor, but these are still rules, and we can play on a level playing field with these rules. And the third for ASEAN is unity. We've really got to open up our market to each other. We often talk to outsiders, 660 million. But do we talk to each other? Like, we have to make it easier to move goods. Now, Singapore, Malaysia, we do move goods a lot. But how many Thai products do you see on Malaysian shelves or Singapore shelves? Not that easy to find, and reverse way around. And we've got to overcome this among ourselves.
Right. I mean, I think it's all about not putting all your eggs in one basket, right? And it's also about, you know, all this unity and diversification and cooperation within ASEAN especially, that's the ASEAN's ethos essentially. And maybe you're right. Maybe countries or smaller countries have gotten a bit, I wouldn't say maybe lazy, or maybe have gotten a bit comfortable with the current trade dynamic, with the current economics setting of the global landscape. So from a global security and political stability standpoint, how might a fragmented supply chain architecture influence power dynamics, especially what's happening right now between the US, China, and even the EU? Maybe, Prof?
Well, I guess it's a bit a hen and egg question, but I guess it cuts the other way around. So we have political tension,
right.
Geopolitical conflict, great power conflict, whatever you call it, and that actually fragments the supply line. So the economy or the economic relations, globalization, if you so wish, has become the victim of great power politics. And I think, and here I can refer and defer to Simon, those who stick to rules, and here we're speaking about WTO rules, trade rules, they need to work together closely to maintain as much as possible of this rules-based multilateral trading world, and of course that would then have a positive impact also on other relations beyond trade, political relations, security relations. ASEAN is a good example for that inside itself. The European Union is a good example for that. Even Latin America, Mercosur is a good example for that. And I think we are in a phase where we start to knit together these blocks. We have an EU-Mercosur free trade agreement now. We don't have one with ASEAN because probably ASEAN isn't ready for it, so we're moving ahead plurilaterally, as we say, with a free trade agreement with Singapore and Vietnam, which we have, Malaysia, which is closer to being completed. But let's see that as stepping stones for a block-to-block free trade agreement. And then I think we can ward off, not totally, but a little bit, sort of the impact of the political, of the great power conflicts on trade.
Right,
I think I just wanted to add to that one of the key elements is to see whether the world can be better with bifurcation or worse. We have to decide that. And really the formula for the last few years has been a lot of innovation comes from the West.
Right.
But in terms of the cost, the scale and improvements, China has been the factory. That's why it is China +1 rather than anybody else +1. They've already earned that role. And now in this time of bifurcation, which Biden started, one of the startling dimensions is when faced with being pushed out, Chinese have responded by innovation. Huawei was cut out. Huawei comes up with a new phone,
different model, yeah.
A new chip, DeepSeek. All this really starts to show that the Chinese aren't going to lie down and play dead. So that makes us, between the US and China, very hard to choose. It's not like the 1990s where America is so far ahead of everybody else. So my hope is that ASEAN can stick to this, neither one nor the other, play with both, show value to both. Because even during the Cold War, there was always a need for some places like Switzerland to be playing on both sides, some intersections. Now, if really both sides pull it completely apart, that will be very difficult.
But how do you see smaller countries, say Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, navigating this delicate balance, right, between benefiting from Western supply chain diversification as well as maintaining strong ties with China? Because you're right, it's still China +1. And also we're looking at such a fragmented and high tension trade situation right now. So how do smaller countries actually do this?
Well, I think first let's look at what they are doing. And they are all, many of them are rushing to Washington, D.C. and trying to talk to Trump. And it feeds Mr. Trump's purpose. He wants them to come talk to them.
Right.
And I think you have to genuflect to America a bit. You don't want to say boo to America. But that's not the essential. The essential is, in the end, to stop some bad practices. There are websites you can say, you buy your stuff in China, you bring it to country XYZ, they take off all the labels and put the label of the XYZ country on. That kind of nonsense has really got to stop. Because today, there's a forensic process of tracking. Did you really make
yeah.
this good in this country? And you'll be having a kind of trust deficit if your country allows this flouting of the rules of origin, which exists in FTA. It's not Mr. Trump invented it. You're supposed to do this. So I think stop those kind of bad practices. Really then reform so that you have the value added, the content in the country. And really proudly say, yeah, some of this may come from China, but we transformed it. We made it a Malaysian product, an ASEAN product.
Right.
And then, hopefully, for fundamental reasons, you can look at everyone and say, this is our product. You want it? Don't want it. It's not China +1, it's ASEAN by itself. Now, that's a longer term goal. And I think it's something worth shooting for because we don't know what the short-term effects of Mr. Trump are. In the 6 months we've had, he's gone from this level of tariffs up, down.
Yes.
You can't do business like this, you know. You can't plan on this kind of variation. So we've got to figure out what fundamentally makes sense for ASEAN, for our countries, and do that first.
May I add to that? I think
Sure.
it's very important what Simon said. If a bloc like ASEAN, I don't know whether you refer to yourself as a bloc, but we see it as a bloc, or we think it should be a bloc. If you want to gain more autonomy in this rough new world or rough brave world, I think you cannot do without moving up the value chain. I mean, not just having raw materials being processed and refined by China, and then you get semi-finished products and you probably work a bit on them and export them to the US or EU, but do that in your own region. And if we look at the region as a whole, I mean, you have it all. I mean, you have the raw material, you have the rare earths in Malaysia, you have the copper and the tin and the cobalt in Indonesia. You have it all there. You have the finance, you have the skilled labor. So a lot of things can be done inside ASEAN. So that means moving up the value chain at the same time, integrating more. And for a big trade bloc like the European Union, it's much easier to deal with ASEAN the more integrated ASEAN is. So I mean, it's not about sort of divide and rule for the Europeans by having sort of one FTA with each singular country. If we can have it with the whole bloc, it makes it much easier, much smoother to trade with one another.
I mean, I know I'm representative of ASEAN as well, but if I'm playing devil's advocate here, of course, Southeast Asia has always been seen as the key beneficiary of the China Plus strategy movement. But do you think, with what you have mentioned just now, but do you think the region is truly ready to absorb sort of large-scale relocations of production, especially in high-tech sectors like semiconductors, for example?
Oh, we kind of want it. I mean, everywhere I go in ASEAN, Indonesia, Vietnam, they don't want the kind of just cheap assembly jobs anymore. I mean, we are producing better talent among the youngsters. We have large populations, some young, not Singapore, but overall ASEAN. So good paying jobs, people value added, realize that they've got to move up. What we may lack is a truly industrial policy. So Vietnam now is trying to say the private sector can be champions. I think each country will have to start to groom champions, and ASEAN-wide, we've got to figure out win-win cooperation. I mean, sometimes we see each other still too much as rivals rather than our bloc or association. We are not customs union, so negotiating tariffs is not possible as a group. But the wider, deeper issue of what can ASEAN add, we see this now from foreign companies. Foreign companies come to Singapore and say, well, we like this about Singapore, but you're too expensive and we need somewhere nearby, too small, we don't have enough people, workers. How about, is there a way to link to Malaysia? That's why we've got the Johor, Singapore, Special Economic Zone. And if this example works out, if this can be a good test case to show the rest of ASEAN, that will help the rest of ASEAN.
I mean, critics are saying that we don't have enough intra-ASEAN trade, so this might be the push for it. With recent tariff war between US, China, and also US and the whole world. So this might be the push and the reassessment that we need.
If I may, one of the mysteries is that, of course, tariff levels at ASEAN is almost zero. But it's the non-tariff measures. Some of the safety
non-tariff barriers as well. You're right.
That's what we've got to get rid of. So in that sense, this problem that Mr. Trump has created for all of us, this urgency, should draw our attention to what is the necessary, difficult homework we've got to really make ourselves an economic community. Sorry.
No, I totally agree. I just wanted to add, and you asked the question, more intra-ASEAN trade will actually make you all less vulnerable. I mean, see the EU example here. Of course, these are old and developed economies, but we're also hit by tariffs from the US if they come. But the portion of our trade with the US is so much smaller, right? Take a country like Germany or France or Italy. 60% of our foreign trade is with other EU countries. So there are no tariffs on that. That means even if the Trump tariffs hit hard, it only hits a relatively small portion of our economy. Whereas here, it could hit you or Vietnam or Thailand very, very hard. If you have more intra-regional trade, it will also shield you against the effects of arbitrary decisions, whether they are in China or in the US or anywhere else.
Right. Right. So I have two more questions to sort of wrap up this discussion on where are we moving forward with regards to China +1. So this is probably looking a bit more forward than where we are right now. But is there any risk that the China +1 strategy could further fuel regional tensions, say by, like you mentioned just now, intensifying competitions between Southeast Asia countries? You are saying just now that we are already looking at each other as rivals. Or maybe creating new economic dependencies, because there is that possibility. We have depended on US, we have depended on China. So maybe, this foreseeable future, this could happen again. What are your thoughts on this, Professor Volker?
Well, look, I think there is a risk for these tensions through competition, everybody feeling squeezed and then going individually to the Chinese or to the Russians or even to the Americans, or even to the Europeans and trying to have an individual trade deal or tariff deal. But that is not necessarily related to a China +1 strategy, right? It would happen once a big bully starts to hit everybody else or trying to hit everybody else. So the natural reaction is often not to join together and deal with a bully together, but everybody tries to cut losses and go there individually. And as Simon said, President Trump likes it very much. I mean, having every country coming as a single country and say, could you please have some exceptions for us and not treat us too badly. And therefore, I would say he dislikes the European Union so much because there is only one negotiator coming and saying, look, I'm speaking for the biggest domestic market in the world, and okay, we also have measures.
Yeah, I mean, he's saying that you guys will probably be the last block that he has to deal with in terms of, getting a tariff deal. So there's that. What about you, Simon? What are your thoughts on this?
I think first, we have to understand that the US-China equation is not easy to escape at all because it's really the pattern for the last 2+ decades. And they are dependent on each other as well.
Right.
So really we're kind of a game that's been developed over time for a very economically rational basis. So what we're trying to do is shift the basis because some people are acting irrationally, not just America. China also has been quite sharp-elbowed at times about different trade, rare earth. If they don't like you, you don't get tourists, you don't sell your goods to China. So we've really got to stand up for rules and amongst ourselves use the rules to integrate deeper. And with those rules, understand that it's not just a question of do I like America or China? Like the rules. Figure out how to work with partners who offer the rules. And if that takes us to the EU, and the EU is a tough negotiator, I can tell you. But that's the game to play rather than try to just curry favor with one or the other. I'm a bit worried in that sense that in this storm created by Mr. Trump, China, or people was pushed towards China. I don't dislike China, but I'm saying a ruleless China is almost as bad as a ruleless America. So really, we've got to find this balance, this reach, and structure it. Now, the last appeal, I think, is that it goes back to the ambitions of our companies, not just the governments and countries, but the companies. Do they see themselves simply as, well, I get an order from America, I do this. America, China, I do this. Or are they really starting to innovate, create, become their own starter of a supply chain? And that's the critical mental change, plus the win-win rather than the outright rivalry among ASEAN countries. There will be some rivalry, of course, but
Right.
if we can innovate and we can become more win-win, we will be heading the right direction.
Right. I think that pretty much wraps up on what we have to do and how we have to respond. Whether or not we will be doing that or we will be responding as what you have said is another discussion. But let's see this as an opportunity to reform, as an opportunity to improve, and an opportunity to diversify and ensure that, you know, our global supply chain can be more than what it is right now. Right, thank you so much to the both of you. That wraps up our conversation on China Plus One and its impact on the global supply chain. Thank you so much, Professor Volker and Professor Simon, for sharing your insights. I'm Fana Sheh. Thank you for watching.
Thank you.